let's say, nature of the panel. Okay, so Motara, do you want to go first? Introduce yourself.
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. Even though I'm not seeing you, and I'm glad to meet you all and be here. I appreciate that. I'm Motara. I'm an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon University at the School of Computer Science in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute. So my work is around algorithmic socio-technical systems and how we can empower everyday users of these systems to work with the developers or other stakeholders in the systems to make these systems accountable, and they can have an informed and transparent and trustworthy interaction with the systems. My work particularly is around marginalized communities, or the communities that the decisions of these algorithmic systems can affect the most. And trust definitely is one of the main factors here, which is intertwined with other factors like transparency, fairness, bias, in other relevant accountability factors. So I'm really happy and glad to be here, and I hope we can have a great and fruitful discussion today.
Okay, great, thank you. So who wants to go next? Philip, Marisa, Finale, maybe Philip. You're the first one on my screen, so.
Okay, hello. I'm Philip from the TU Wien, the Vienna University of Technology. Thank you so much for the invitation to that event. My research is based around drivers cooperating with automated vehicle. I think that's a very interesting starting point, because it's one of the earliest occasions where people operate a very complex AI control system in a really safety critical environment. So when we talk about explainability and transparency or trust, or how I frame it as cooperation overall, I think it's really interesting in a way that first of all, that's a continuous system. So there is no time to wait to inspect decisions deeply. Everything has to work in split-second decisions, and this makes it a really interesting use case. And I look forward to have nice and interesting discussions with the other panel members.
Okay, great. Marisa?
Hello, everyone. My name is Marisa Chop. I'm also very grateful and thankful that you have invited me here, especially because I am probably the only not classic academic researcher here in the panel or in the whole room. So I think maybe I'm more presenting an industry perspective here. I'm a corporate researcher, so I work in a cybersecurity company here in Zurich, where I focus on human AI interaction, so to speak. Specifically looking at conversational AI, more specifically focusing on off-the-shelf conversational AI. So the classic Alexa series, so the things we are at hand, and looking at how we perceive them and how that influences our behavior. Started out with lots of trust topics, performance topics, and now moving more into the direction of how do users perceive the relationship with conversational AI. And yeah, I think as Philip said, it's he likes to work in a safety critical environment, and I think well, nobody dies from talking to Alexa, but I think there are some other issues we all obviously know about, like privacy, data protection, and even going to addiction and stuff like that. So it's another dimension of topics I am focusing on.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Finale?
Hi, I'm Finale Doshi-Velez. I'm a professor in computer science at Harvard. My main research has to do with probabilistic methods and sequential decision-making, but my angle into trust and interpretability and accountability for AI systems is that my main application area is in healthcare. So I think it's actually really interesting. So it's safety critical, but often not time critical to fill your domain. So we're working in situations where we're analyzing large amounts of health record data and then trying to determine what the recommendations should be based off of those data. So I've worked in explainable systems, interpretable systems, as well as overall broadly thinking about how to make systems accountable, not only in healthcare, but more broadly.
Thank you so much. So maybe I just start with a question from Motara, who is working on, let's say, intersection of trust and transparency, as she already mentioned this. And let's say one of the first of all, the first question would be, how do you differentiate between transparency and trust in the system? And one of the aspects that you mentioned in your work is that transparency does not always lead to trust. So too much transparency can also even reduce trust in the system. So the question that I have here would be, don't you think that that would be like the definition of over trust in the system? Like if you differentiate between appropriate level of trust and over trust in the system, and how do you differentiate between like not having trust or having over trust in the system? I hope the question was clear.
Yeah, sure. I think you are trying, if I'm understanding correctly, you are asking about how we understand if users have over trust or under trust in a system, or what is the right level of trust? Is that right? Or
exactly, yeah.
Okay.
And how transparency is like related to that.
To that, okay, yeah, that's actually a very good question, and I think it's the $1 million question that everyone researchers are trying to find out. So, not that I have a very clear answer, but I can give probably an idea about how this ecosystem of trust is working around users' interaction with the system. So as you said, we have this over trust or under trust. Actually, there are now people talking about different versions of this when it's about algorithmic or AI systems. Some call this over trust algorithm appreciation, which is, you trust what a system does. It's AI, you think it's just unmitigated good, it's gonna just give you what you need. And then we have the other side of the spectrum, which is under trust, which also called algorithm aversion, which is users just see a mistake from a system and they don't trust it at all anymore. So actually there have been research showing that if your system is doing good, like for example, a system it's a recommender system, for example, make it easy, it's making different decisions and it's doing good, it starts with your trust. It's like, you interact with a human. And then, but so that might actually result in algorithm appreciation if you see, well, the system is doing great. But then if a system makes one mistake, your trust is going to be broken. But the difference is that you won't forgive the algorithm while you forgive a human, because studies have shown that users don't believe algorithms can fix their mistakes or make a new decision, which is not true. We are training them, they're going to learn from the mistakes, they're going to do it again. Sorry, I think I'm frozen. Let me get back. Okay, so but yeah, that's, I think, the dynamics here. And about transparency, to trust and transparency definitely are intertwined factors, but it doesn't mean that they have a flat correlation. It doesn't mean more transparency is more trust, as Mala mentioned too. So there has been a lot of research. So when this area of transparency started a few years ago, everyone was like, oh, let's provide transparency, we need transparency. And I actually was one of those who wanted transparency to be in this system. But at the same time, there is this caveat that as too much transparency can actually ruin trust. Too much transparency can also create burden, and too much transparency can actually sometimes be used as a mechanism to confuse users, which some industry can use actually as in a negative way. If they, if you provide users tons of information and they are not there, like for example, if you're a professional in healthcare, even you're a professional user, you're not like a Facebook user, just want to scroll down and just see some news and go and continue your day. Even that algorithm system is your day, it's still like too much information is gonna be an obstacle in doing your job. And if you can find the right information in the right time, it can actually make it harder for you to make a decision, and it can ruin trust. So finding that sweet spot of transparency, and also when to provide that transparency. So that sweet spot, people usually looking at the content of transparency, but also I look at like when and where. So transparency, like sometimes needs to have a progressive nature, you know, like maybe you should not reveal everything at the first time. You should reveal it depending on the request, depending on the situation. These are really hard questions, and there is no one answer fits all here. It's really context dependent, as we just had different contexts here, you know, like self-driving cars or cars is very different from healthcare, or like Alexa talking. They all need different levels of trust, creating levels of transparency. So yeah, I think it's going to be a challenging question, but it's interesting to see how it adapts to different situations.
Okay, so do you mean, I'm just trying to see if I understand you correctly. Do you mean this, the sweet spot of transparency is like based on appropriate trust, or is it like related, or should be like measured how, you know, the level of transparency needed based on appropriate trust?
Yeah, definitely trust is one of the factors to evaluate transparency, but definitely not the only one. So for example, assume that we have a good system, we have a system, I mean, and they have a good level of trust, which everyone is trusting, but the system is making biased decisions. So that's not appropriate. So trust is one of the factors that defines users' relationship with the system, but there are other factors that we need to evaluate at the same time. Like, is it a fair decision? Also understandability. Usually understandability and trust are very relevant, because, you know, if I don't understand what you are saying, probably I won't trust you. But trust is one of the most complex constructs I've ever seen that people try to measure. As we know, in human relationship, trust is also not something, I mean, yes, you can ask, do you trust that person or not? But do you trust that person on what? Do you trust that person? Like, so that's actually even harder in computer systems, because we don't even know how this relationship work yet, as much as we know how human relationships work. So to find the right level of transparency, we have tons of measures that different researchers use to understand. And most of those measures usually interact with trust. But also how to measure that trust or define that trust is a hard question. Like this area of XAI, which is explainable AI, or ML, interpretable ML, or transparency, like they are all exploding. And I've seen a lot of amazing work out there, but sometimes I even don't see, okay, what is a great question or great set of questions for measuring trust? Or sometimes there is one more thing, is that trust is not a single point. You know, when you build a relationship with a person, it takes time to build trust, and your trust with that person changes over time. That's also something we need to study more, like trust, the dynamics of trust. But again, we can only rely on trust. Like if we build a system with a level of transparency that everyone says, I trust, that's definitely important, but not enough. So just to be clear, like we need all those categories of variables to be made sure to evaluate.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Marisa and Motara talked a little bit about algorithmic aversion, and you know, the point where users lose their trust in the system, and that is not like repairable in many of the cases, and leads to algorithmic aversion. So what do you think? Because I think in one of your or the paper that I read from you, you mentioned that trust can be repaired. So my question to you would be, do you think trust is repairable? And because it's like a tricky thing, right? Because we are like interacting with systems that do not have this mutual relationship. So we don't have mutual trust. So trust is like one way in when it comes to technology. So how do you see that? This would be my first question, and the second one related to also what Matara said about measuring trust. So my question would be, especially when it comes to continuous interaction, do you have methods in industry that would like monitor continuous interaction, or let's see, to measure how trust evolves or changes over time?
Yeah, so I had to write down your questions. Can I just, I would just like to I'd like to have the opportunity to have a few comments on what Mutahari said. I think there were some really, really valuable points. I would like to, if I can, give 2 comments and then answer your questions, if that is okay.
Yes, of course.
Because maybe I just one comment about the transparency, the discussion you mentioned. I think you mentioned some very valuable points here, and I wanted to add that I'm not really sure if trust is the right lighthouse to measure transparency, so to speak, or the guideline, or the grail or whatsoever. I think it is, of course, they are somewhat correlated, but I think transparency is more about responsibility, about liability, and so on. So I think much more important in this context is the topic of the ethical and normative standards that come with transparency. So if we want to design for transparency, we have to look at the law sooner or later, especially with the AI Act coming up and stuff like that. So I think even though if we have all these cool guidelines how to create transparency on a content or on a delivery level, much more I think we'll have to look at, what do the rules and regulations say, which we will have to follow within the next 3 years. So that's, I think, just one comment I wanted to add on to your insights. And the other thing I wanted to comment on, which kind of flows into your question, Mala, is you were talking about the trust dynamics. And I think this narrative that trust takes time to be built, I'm not sure if this is accurate, so to speak, especially in the context of conversational AI. I think we have, or for instance, the trust trajectories, so to speak, are different. And I don't think it's this idea that, it's built within over time and increases. I think this is what this trust takes time narrative conveys. I think that trust dynamics are very peculiar, and sometimes they start very high and then decrease, or they start very low and increase, or nothing happens at all, or they have these, you don't really know, right? So I think this is the comment, and it also flows into the question you said, do people lose their trust over time, or what's happening? So what we've seen within our research basically is that usually, so we're working with conversational AI, and there's basically no transparency, and also they're unpredictable within their performance. Even the computer scientists trying to predict the performance, even they don't know how, for instance, Alexa or Google Assistant will react to a certain question if we give them a task, and so on. So what we did is we gave them the opportunity to evaluate their IQ, so to speak, their level of performance, then rate their trust level, then actually do get a better understanding of what they're actually capable of, and then rate their trust level again. And what's been happening in, I don't know, the majority of cases, that there's a large overestimation of the capabilities of conversational AI. They have no idea, or they were surprised themselves that, what can't do this and that. And I would say the majority of people are really disappointed in what the conversation agent is capable of. They have really high expectations. So if we're talking about trust calibration, if we calibrate it with the level of performance, usually what's happening is that they adapt their expectations, and they say, okay, Alexa's pretty stupid or whatsoever, like now in lay language, and it doesn't necessarily mean, though, that their level of trust decreases, though. It seems to just be rather stable. They're just seem to have different expectations or whatsoever. But we couldn't really see in the measures that there was a really high level of trust in the beginning, but they did, in another measure, massively overrated the capabilities. So there were really some interesting, inconsistent insights we got there.
That's a very interesting point that you mentioned. And I would like to ask Philip. Philip, do you have any comments to what Marisa said? Otherwise, I would like to ask you, because I think you already worked on, you also worked on explainability and let's say measuring trust in the system. I also have this question of what do you think is the, how do you differentiate between transparency and explainability? So why is it that you work on explainability and not transparency? Because I think these two terms are very, very related. What is the difference for you?
Actually, so I start with a comment as well about these trust and trust dynamics and trust repairment. I think the tricky part is that we lack basically the kind of studies that really investigate trust dynamics in a deep way, because we often do lab studies. We look at interaction over a short period of time, or at least how our labs where I've worked in the past have done it. And there we see some interesting things that are not predicted by theory. So for example, it says that when there would be a failure, we would see trust decline very quickly, and it would take a lot of time to repair the trust if it would ever happen. In the studies that we've done, we could see that with every new trial, even after a failure, the trust as we measured it with these standardized scales got up very quickly to the levels they had before these errors. And at least I'm lacking the proper explanations for that. And I don't know if it's just a thing of bad experimental design, or if it really has something to do with trust. That's something for the future.
So my question would be, sorry for interrupting, but this is a panel. So do you think algorithmic aversion doesn't exist, or does not exist in a way that, let's say, Motahara mentioned at the beginning?
I think it's just not that easy to compare trust in AI systems or machine with the kind of interpersonal trust, because we do so much with other people. And other people are, of course, different, but at some degree, they're also like we are. And we know how it works when we betray some other's trust, and we understand that we might need to behave differently and to repair these people's trust over time. I think this is where the transparency, for example, hits in. It's so tricky to look into the hood of these AI systems. So people might even think, okay, there was some kind of failure, but as I have no clue on why that failure happened, maybe the decision in the very next situation, but I cannot even differentiate between those two situations. So it's so hard for users to see, to also track back why did the failure happen, for example, or to see in a potentially new situation where you might expect, okay, given on my experiences, I expected failure to happen again. But if it's not happening again, if the outcome is then good, maybe you think, okay, the system hasn't changed. Maybe it was just some floppy, maybe a sensor was dirty or whatsoever, just coming up with very simple explanations, and then the trust is high again. So I think one of these reasons for these kind of behaviors is to some degree, all these cool companies that sell us their systems, we might think, or at least this is something we have experienced in Germany, where there's very high trust in the car industry, for example, in general, that these systems would not be on the market if they wouldn't be trustworthy. And this creates some differences in the dynamics, I feel. Regarding your question, I do not see that big difference of transparency and explainability. I would, from my personal perspective, I would say that transparency is something that can be, that doesn't need that kind of technical detail. So I just want to explain why or how our system is doing something, but I don't really look under the hood on how that is technically achieved. Well, for me, explainability would be more towards the really making these opaque models explainable, to find out what kind of parameters we're responsible for certain decisions. But that's not always the kind of explanation or transparency that the end user might need.
Okay, thank you very much. Finale, do you want to also, maybe you want to start with a,
Ask a quick question.
Oh, okay, yeah, of
Sorry
course.
for jumping in.
Yeah, no,
I don't
no,
want to.
that's the way you
I'm-
should do it.
I'm wondering, question to everybody, isn't algorithm aversion or appreciation? I'm just wondering, should we differentiate here between, does it make sense to differentiate between the traits and an attitude of a person? And this is why, isn't one rather a trait and the other rather an attitude, and which ergo doesn't make them the same concept? Or was that the idea, to have that being the same concept? Does
Motar,
that make sense, my question?
Motar, do you maybe want to take the question?
Yeah, but I'm not sure what you
Yeah,
were
okay.
meaning with one is trait and what is attitude. Is it like, can you elaborate on that?
Good. Yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering, that's actually also kind of my question. I'm just wondering if it would make sense that that attitude is something that would rather change over time, where traits are rather stable constructs of the person.
Yeah, so one thing that is definitely affecting this whole algorithm aversion or appreciation is people's trait and personality. There has been work talking about and expectations of AI. I think some people talked about that. So we've seen rather different, very different um, um, expectations and perceptions of AI system depending on, like, for example, how tech savvy you are, or how savvy you are as a user in general. You might not be a tech savvy person, but you might be very good social media user in terms of good interaction, like a lot of interactions. Like, so you might be actually more savvy than a tech savvy person. And so there are a lot of stuff, but since AI is, and again, trust definitely depends on people's traits, but human trust and AI trust are very different as well. So again, like, at least so far work has shown that, I mean, some people definitely build relationships with these systems. And I mean, how much of these relationships are healthy or appropriate or similar to human interaction, that's still a question to answer. But particularly some of those systems that might, like, we've seen that some of you probably seen the hair movie that people built. That's just a conversational AI. So whether that's funny or interesting, it can happen, and we can see more of those. We have some intimate type of AI systems, like that they might play actually the role, or when they like place as a placement of another person. But most of what I've seen is that because this is all new to people, like, not like new in terms of like AI is not new, but still very young versus like human to human relationship, people are still building that whatever trait is towards AI or attitudes towards AI, and that's why it can change and develop over time. But the other thing I've seen is that the lack of enough education or literacy on AI, and that might change, for example, in the next decade. Like, as we teach, for example, math in the schools now, if we teach about AI or general, like, topics of AI, people's perception of AI might be very different even before they start working with a specific AI system. So to me, it's right now, there is not much trait yet. It's more of features of that person that can change. Your tech savviness can change, or your savviness of using a system can change. I don't think that the dynamics of trust to AI is similar to human trust. And whether there might be a trait later in terms of your personality working with AI systems, definitely is relevant. So if you are a person who is a pessimistic person, probably, like you probably, when a system makes a mistake, it would be harder for you to accept the next decision versus a person who is optimistic. So definitely traits play a role, but I don't think they are similar to your traits affecting human relationship, at least in that level.
Okay, so maybe now that you're talking, maybe I ask my question. Do you agree with the definition that Philip gave about the, transparency and explainability?
So I view kind of it more broadly, in the sense that transparency is often referring to many things. It could be transparency about the data that was used. It could be transparency around what was the objective function, like were we optimizing for more clicks or were we optimizing for something else? And then I think when you talk about the model, then transparency about the model, explanation of the model, they're all kind of very similar terms. They're referring to the same. One thing that I also wanted to bring out that I thought was really interesting is this point of like, where is the trust coming from and where does the responsibility lie? Like Philip, you mentioned that overall, let's say you have high trust in automakers. So kind of considering like, do you trust your car? And what does it mean to trust your car versus you trust the automaker and therefore you trust that your car will behave and do the right thing when you drive it. I think there's a really important analog to that with AI systems as well. We've done like a small study with clinicians, primary care doctors, where we were exploring an interface with them and none of them asked us, is this calibrated or something? We were presenting them with numbers, recommendations. And so like we asked them at the end of the interview, like, but what about trust? And they were like, well, if the hospital did not trust this system, why would they have bought it? Like we are assuming at the point of care, we are not asking, do I trust this AI system? That we assume that somebody else has vetted the system and made this decision properly for us. And I think that's just really important to consider, like, what is the role of like oversight from a regulatory body, from a procurement body, while also making sure that enough information is available at a point of decision or point of contact that someone can engage in self-advocacy if necessary or if they wish to, so that like there's information that's available to that individual clinician, that individual patient, to question a decision. But the expectation shouldn't be that in a 20-minute office visit you're going to fully try to understand what every part of this AI system is doing.
Finale, do you think there's a difference between, let's say, reliance and trust? Because you mentioned this. Do you think there is, when I rely on the system, I automatically also trust the system, or is there a difference when it comes to try and reliability?
That's a good question. I haven't really thought about that. I mean, certainly, I think if or we deal a lot with over-reliance in systems, and I tend to think about that as over-trust in systems. I'm curious what other people think on that point.
Okay, yeah. Marisa, maybe you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think also this is a topic, if I can say that, Philip and I have been discussing a lot, the difference between trust and reliance. And I find it also very interesting, for instance, that in Germany, we don't have a difference, like the words are the same, they're both the same, but in English they are different. So I find that also interesting. But anyways, to make it really short, so I think we are really on the same line here, think, okay, trust is the attitude, which you can measure, and reliance is more the behavior, the outcome variable of what happens when you trust or when you do X, then you rely on something. So it's more a behavioral outcome than instead of a psychometric concept you want to measure. From our work, I can only give you maybe one interesting perspective from our research on the privacy paradox. I'm sure some of you are maybe one word about it, or is that clear to everyone? So for instance, what we do, so we've been looking at the privacy paradox a lot, which is basically that humans say that they care about privacy a lot. So, and they intend to behave that way, but in their real life, they don't care, and they still use these products, and they still give their consent to everything if for so and so reason, group pressure, pressure from the boss, pressure from the company, we have to use it. Just like I think, was it the nurses with the examples? I wasn't sure, sorry for that, but they say, okay, we use it because we have to. And I mean, somebody probably has tested it, or some have to and they don't trust it, but they still have to use it. So we've been trying to look at, okay, what, you know, most of the research has been directed at the basically no trust, no use hypotheses, or people trust something, hence they use it. There's also a lot of stuff going on, especially with conversational AI, since there's been a lot of privacy conflicts that they actually don't trust the system or say they don't trust it, but they still use it. And this is also something we'd say, okay, this is some sort of trust and reliance where you can think about and discriminate these two concepts.
Thank you very much. Motara, do you agree actually with what has been said about trust and reliance, and also the difference between transparency and explainability?
Yeah, so actually, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot, and I think it was brought up very interestingly here, is that what I call the paradox of trust. I don't know if we still have that, but we do have a paradox of privacy that has been well studied. That is like, you know, we have many users that say, I know this system violates my privacy. You know, they collect data and they, you know, a lot of social media platforms, for example, or a lot of advertising algorithms used in many of these online platforms. And then people still use that. You know, like people say that I know that my privacy, this is not the way that to treat my privacy, but still they use that. And I think trust might come actually to that level. I don't have any scientific particularly results, but I've seen that a lot in my studies and like people's behavior, that, you know, you might not trust, particularly then. There are two levels of trust here that I want to make it clear in terms of like also the reliance, is that, you know, trust is not only to the AI, but to the AI maker. So this has been actually showed, this one by research, that if you don't trust the entity or the organization or the person who made AI, you are not going to trust transparency or that system whatsoever, regardless of the. So, I mean, again, this is like a significantly correlation based, so you still might, there might be exceptions, but for example, there has been a study on advertising algorithms on social media, and then I think it was on one of the social media platforms like Facebook, I believe, and then they asked this question of if you trust Facebook in general, you know, and again, like trust in what? Like there are a lot of dimensions, but in general, they tried to measure the trust, and then they found and there were different transparency mechanisms that some might actually be good, but then the people who did not trust Facebook, they did not trust the transparency mechanism. Because if you don't trust, again, I'm using this analogy of person, not that they are similar, AI and person, but just to make it easier. Like if I don't trust a person, I won't trust what they say, even they say it right, even that's the right saying. So, so that's also make it different in terms of reliability, that you might trust a decision, but you might not rely on that, or vice versa. And also reliance, as Marisa said, is a very behavioral measure, you know, like I don't think you can, if you want to measure reliability, again, also they are very intertwined, but if you want to measure reliability, you can't just ask them, do you rely on the system or the decisions? You need to observe the behavior. Do they really follow the decisions? Do they really agree? Or like, this is like, so the best way to measure it actually is to follow the logs of the behaviors, for example, if you want to do it at least quantitatively. But trust is harder because trust is a very personal measurement, you know, like, so that's for that. And explainability and transparency, or interpretability and understandability, I've seen all of these factors, and people talk about, are they the same? Are they different?
Do you think we need this broad terminology? Do you think we really need all of that?
Yeah, I don't know. I've started this area like 10 years ago. And when I started this, it was very narrow or niche. I even couldn't find enough literature to fit into like literature review work or something. But now this area is, yeah, I think Philip agrees. And then now this area is exploding. I can't keep up. Even I'm an expert in this area, I can't keep up with all the work, which is great. I mean, this is funny because when I started this, many senior amazing people that I respect their knowledge and everything, they were asking very serious questions like, why are you even talking about this? Like, this is like there was this analogy that I sometimes use is the cars. It was like, I had this question from someone expert, not in this area, but just an expert computer science, was like, hey, why you think you even bring this transparency and this concept, and we need to evaluate that because, you know, we drive our cars every day and we don't know how the engines work. We didn't know for hundreds of years now, and we are fine. And I think this is like, this was actually a very good question, because I was like, oh, maybe so this whole thing is wrong, or we don't need to study that. But then over time, it changed a lot, you know, like now we are talking about, hey, transparency is not an unmitigated good, but then also there were differences here. So for example, over years, I found, okay, definitely AI systems are different from cars, because first of all, when your car breaks, you know, it breaks, you know, it's broken, you know, it catches on fire or like just stops working. But an AI system might be broken in terms of, you know, they might not perform well in some, or they might be biased or something, and people might not know for years. You know, we have tons of these news articles about AI systems being biased, making wrong decisions, and people not knowing and just following them or relying on them. And the other difference here is that if your car breaks, you know what to do. The next one is call a mechanic or call your insurance company. There is no clear mechanism still in this area when an AI system breaks, whatever breaking means. So this is like why the start of this whole area of understandability, transparency, but then they evolved over time in different branches. Some, as Marisa mentioned, is for responsibility. You know, you're supposed to provide transparency, but do users understand that transparency? Do users that transparency affect their behavior? That's another story. Then we have explainability. You might provide transparency, but it's not explainable well, or like, I honestly think that these are different forms of the same thing, but in different, like, it's like choice and reliance. Some cultures or some languages might not even have. So I think my language doesn't have this two difference between explainability and interpretability, or like they are pretty similar. So it's really hard sometimes to also to measure those. So I definitely see a need to consolidate these and like decide, okay, we need to, and it's great. I think it's great that everyone is using different terms. They're trying to understand, because that's the goal. We don't want to all like follow one single path, because that's not how research works. But we want to be innovative. We want to bring new topics and factors into the work. But at the same time, I believe that this is getting, because it's getting a really large area, we definitely need as researchers to take a step back, sit and talk. Okay, what is going on? Like, what is this area is exploding? And then everyone is trying to measure something, which is great. I've done that, but now I'm seeing, okay, we need something as a larger level. For example, one piece that I really like is this work that calls seeing without knowing, which is about the limitations of transparency. And they talk about that, you know, like, but that's mainly call it transparency. Is it explainability? Is it just claims true for understandability? Or like, what I genuinely believe is that transparency without being understandable, explainable, or interpretable is useless, and can be used actually as a scapegoat for many industries to just say that, okay, we followed these rules, or like, for example, we have GDPR in Europe, like we followed GDPR, we provided transparency, and that's it. So I think what is important is that like the definition of transparency itself should have all of these factors in it. Because if people can't understand, or like, even when I say people, not just users, like maybe a policy stakeholder, they need to understand what this transparency means. If I provide how this my whole system works in code, like, okay, I'm going to release the code to you. Is that transparent? They're going to say this is transparent. I don't call that transparency. I think transparency is definitely interweaved and intertwined with all this understandability, but people might have different definitions of transparency. That's something that we need to hopefully come up in the next few years with consolidating all these topics together.
Wow.
I can jump in. I thought your point about, if you don't trust someone, you're not going to trust what they say. Like they might say all the right words and you're still not going to trust them. And I that really resonated with me when I think of AI systems, actually, because like as builders of these systems, we know that you can have the system check a bunch of boxes and still be doing completely awful things in some other part of the space, right? And I'm curious what people think there, because like from a regulatory space, there's been kind of different models. Like, do you vet the system or do you vet the vendor, right? Like, do you say, I trust the person who creates the system and therefore I mostly trust the system? And we've been looking at these AI procurement checklists that ask a bunch of really good questions, like what was the data that was used, blah, blah, blah. But even then, like as an expert, I can be like, oh, if they don't tell me about this thing, I'm going to be suspicious. But for just an average user of the public, they might be like, oh, okay, it looks like they've given me lots of information about how they did this properly. Maybe I should trust the system, or maybe you go bump up again and be like, but I just don't trust this company. And so I think it's a really interesting like question of like, how would you actually get me to believe that a system is doing the right thing?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's the main challenge, because I've been working with some industry practitioners or professionals and been actually in industries before. So I've seen teams genuinely try to provide transparency. And I've seen that people will still say that, I don't think they are saying the truth. Mm-hmm. Even, it's when you provide a transparency mechanism, someone in the company is not sitting and writing that. It's like an automated generated transparency content, but at the same time, they are hiding those parts that
and maybe it's not even intentional, right? Like you provide data on, oh, this algorithm isn't biased with respect to race and gender, but then it turns out that it's really biased with respect to age or with respect to some other random variable, like how often you use this particular street, or something like this, and that impacts disparately a particular class of people.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't find that, right? Like with just a set of questions that you ask.
Exactly. And I think one of the main challenges that we haven't talked about, but I think someone mentioned, like, Flip, these are black boxes, is that what I've seen, and it's very also probably all of you agree, that even the developers of these systems, in many cases, they don't know how these systems work, because these, particularly now, machine learning algorithms or neural networks. So sometimes even if a developer tries to provide a transparency mechanism, they might not know, as I said, other random variables might come in use. And there are also behaviors that I call emergent behaviors, which is, when you deal with a system, we all know there are many probabilistic features at play. So it's not like this is not an old, like, simple if this or else then. This is not how the code works right now. So there are things that might not happen now, but later. And people and the developers of the system even don't know about, because users are going to play with the system and users are going to create new data to train the system. And what happens is that they provided transparency mechanisms. They thought they were pretty good, but as you said, new things might come up, and then users' trust might be broken, because it's okay, in your transparency mechanism, you did not bring this up, and now it's actually the opposite of what you said. So I think these are all playing factors here, but
and maybe that goes back to this trust as an iterative process, or like where maybe some of the trust also comes from, or calibrated trust comes from, like a reporting mechanism where the user says, hey, this is funny. And the company actually does something about it and fixes it, and that might just overall build your trust in that, okay, the system might not always behave, but I know that it's continually being improved toward the thing that I want.
Yeah, I totally agree that, if you could get users engaged with these kind of reports, or longitudinal transparency, over time, it changes, that can definitely affect their interaction. But I think one of the most challenging designs of design implications or factors in transparency and in trust is that users usually don't transparency mechanisms other than their expectation is violated. So if everything is going well, as a social media user, you're not going to click on every post and see, why am I seeing this, right? So that's also the hard part, that we just, if we provide even the right mechanisms, if users don't interact with those mechanisms, we can't really get them to work with the system or get to the goal we want to. So I think it's a lot of dynamics here that is really hard. And I don't know if there's a solution to how, but this is what I call when transparency isn't transparent. Like, you know, when even people don't see these transparency mechanisms, whether they want or not, but it's also another challenge. And if we don't have that interaction, then we can't even actually build that levels of change and dynamics, which affects their trust as well. So, I mean, that's not good news, but I'm just bringing this up as a challenge.
Yeah, let me jump in here maybe. So I think this in this field, and we talked about that reliance and trust, and I sometimes I wonder, because I think at least what I want with my research, it's rather appropriate reliance than appropriate trust. Because in the end, I want this partnership of human and some system to be successful. And if that works, actually, I don't even care that much if these mechanisms that led to these successful corporations are trust or understanding of systems, for example. So I'm really wondering why so many people seem not to make a difference between these two concepts, because I really think there is a big difference, actually.
Okay, so I think, thank you very much. I think I need to like take the give the moderation to Alex over for like online questions and any questions that she might have, and then we're gonna like see or discuss some of the questions of the participants here.
Yeah, thank you so much. So if while waiting for the online questions coming in, I want to quickly ask my question generally to the panel. And this question is inspired actually by the field of application of Finale's work, because your group is working on healthcare. And I think healthcare is an interesting case because apart from developers and end users who are doctors, there is another group of stakeholders in that triangle of interaction, which are people affected by the decision making. And I was wondering, in your experience, to which extent the current methods of understanding trust or of establishing transparency or interchangeability tools, to which extent all the current methods do they account for people who are affected by the decision making? And should we do more about that, actually?
So I think there's two parts to this question. One part is kind of checking a system beforehand to make sure that it is safe. And that's kind of in healthcare, that's like the like do no harm is your starting point. And I think there we typically are developing forms of transparency for experts to be able to determine safety. That said, I think there's a really rich area when it comes to the patient interaction. First of all, there should be transparency to the patient, which does not even exist now. You know, when you go in and they say your blood pressure is high, it's like, by what standard, right? Like, for what population? So we have this issue even before AI in healthcare for the patient population to know where those numbers are coming from, and is it people who look like you? Or behave like, whose bodies behave like yours. And I think there's a really rich opportunity for us to create interfaces where clinicians can have discussions with patients, patients can have discussions with clinicians on these topics. And we've explored the space just a little bit, where just making things about the algorithms more transparent and more just, visually workable means that suddenly it's not a doctor who's just like looking at their computer, but it's a conversation that the two of them can have. And, oh, okay, if you're not caring about sleep issues, then maybe these are other treatment options that become available and make it interactive.
Does anyone else have a comment about integrating the experiences of people affected by decision making, or people who are affected by the algorithms, but they are not necessarily interacting with them?
I can add a quick comment. Yeah,
Sure.
so one thing I've seen is that I've recently started work a lot with public algorithmic systems, which means like usually, you know, like it's in public agencies use algorithmic systems to make decisions about citizens. And then I've seen that a lot also happening, you know, it's like of a change of events. Sometimes I call it butterfly effect, you know, like sometimes even you don't know who those users are. You know, I mean, in healthcare, I can give you an example, you know, like as a patient and a doctor, and I'm also working with some other like caregivers, you know, for example, it's an elderly, and then those caregivers might not ever interact with the system directly, but then the decisions definitely affect the caregiver's decision or like how they behave. But sometimes it's even harder to understand who those users are, you know, like for example, going back to the public algorithmic systems, we've seen a lot of like decisions that can have, then it can maybe just affects a family, but it might affect a child, but then the family, but the friends, but then in the larger or extended the scope of extended family, and then other people that you even don't know. And then also it's not about who affects that we don't know, is that also the long time of the effect. We had this algorithm, there is this new work that I really like, it's called algorithm imprint or AI imprint.
I was about to mention that, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Is that so even a system is wrong, whether it's biased or making wrong decisions, and you stop that decision, the decisions are already made, or like they are still affecting other people, you know, like for example, there was this example of the UK algorithm in the education system that when COVID hit, they started using this AI system to predict grades or like college admissions. And then they found it's like they were purchased, it was biased, and they stopped that, but that did not stop the effects. So I think this whole scope of who it affects that we even don't know, and also how long it's affect, it's a very good point, which unfortunately is very vague. And I don't know even if you could ever can scope this. It's just like every other thing, like, you know, our actions can have effects that we don't know, can affect other people, like, but at the same time, I think that's a warning that like how much care and thought needs to be done in the process of even developing these systems. We can't develop the systems and just let it out and say, okay, we can fix it later. We can fix it later, because again, this butterfly effect, I think that can happen, and we don't know really how to even know that effect, let alone to fix it. So sorry, that was supposed to be brief.
No, it's okay. So it was an interesting comment, and for those who are interested into exploring the area of perception experiences of people affected by algorithm decision making, I think the paper that you mentioned, the algorithmic impact, it's a FACT 2022 paper, would be a very interesting read, and an interesting introduction to the entire socio-technical ecosystem and interactions with AI.
Okay, so
Can I
there
ask a
are no
question?
other. Okay.
Sorry, I raised the hand.
Yes, perfect. Yes. Yeah, so I was just seeing if anyone else had a last comment, but I think you can go ahead with the question. Absolutely. Go ahead, Magdalena.
Cool. Hi, everyone. Thank you, first of all, for a super interesting discussion. As usual, when I think about these things, my mind seems to explode. I have a question. So this whole workshop is kind of themed around calibrated trust. And previously in the morning session, we were discussing what is calibrated trust, and the definition or the assumption that we kind of agreed on was, well, a trust perception of a user or a person that is appropriate to the trust that a system should receive. So there's this, but for that, we need to know what a system is capable of, or we need to know how a system performs. And I think it was Marissa, at least, you said that in your case with conversational agents, sometimes we just don't know how a system performs. And I think Motahari, you said something about emergent behaviors that come out of, like, if a user uses a system for the first time and we let it out in the wild. And so and then my question is, and I would be curious how you would perceive that. If we don't know about if we don't know how a system performs, how can we ever arrive at calibrated trust? And I think whoever has something to say, I don't mind.
Can I quickly jump in, since you said my name, and I'm trying to make it brief also, but I think this is also why I'm working with why I love working with off-the-shelf conversational AI, because they're neither transparent nor explainable. So it doesn't matter, right? So the only thing that matters is what does the consumer, what does the user perceive? And we've been focusing on that since, also because we've spent, I think, 3 years in trying to develop a metric for evaluating the capabilities, and we're nowhere. And I haven't seen anyone yet. I know there's a workshop now at ICHKAI trying to create metrics for evaluating AI and stuff. So I think we're nowhere. So this is why we're really focusing on, the perception of performance, the perception of the other things. I think the others are focusing probably on the perception of transparency or whatsoever. And I think it makes a huge difference. And also, if we're maybe just a little bit on a side note, and then I'm going to stop it, because also when you're looking at the current Lambda discussions where people, say the Google AI is sentient and so, and then people talk about the consciousness of machines, which is basically nonsense. But what is important is, what does the consumer believe? What does it perceive it is? And how does that influence the behavior? So obviously, I think it's important to kind of understand. The goal is to have both an objective measure of performance, but especially, and just talking about my case here, but this is neither realistic, probably, and we're going nowhere there. And so this is why we're focusing on perceived competences and perceived etc.
So basically, sorry if I just need to understand. So you're saying there is no calibrated trust in your area. It's just about how people perceive something, because there's no standard we can calibrate it to.
Not on a, not if you don't know it, you have to, there's no pre-calibration possible. It's only, the calibration is only possible during interaction and with a longer period of interaction, because you will never know how it works beforehand. You cannot, you don't get any information, you may, you can maybe look at advertisement and stuff like that, but you calibrate your trust probably according to, your perception of performance.
Mm-hmm. That's a very tough one. So let me add please here. I think a lot of this notion of calibrated trust, that comes from classical automated systems, where it's so clear what performance actually means. And that is also very easy in my automated car research, because the system is successful when it stays on the road. And it's a failure describable. This is the kind of performance that we can calibrate through. When we ask some conversational AI a question, what would performance even mean? There are many, many answers that could be right or wrong for a particular person. So it's somehow I have to agree with Marisa. On the other hand, I'm also very curious, because the subjective trust is already the fuzzy thing. So I think we don't make it better when we say, oh, let's make the performance fuzzy too, then we can align it somehow. I'm not sure if this is the perfect way that we should see it.
Okay, so maybe I just jump in if there are no other questions from online participants, to take some questions from the participants who are here with us. One question to you, Philip, directly is, do we actually need explainability when it comes to low risk use cases? So your your work is mainly around automated vehicle, but as Motahari mentioned, when it comes to transparency and explainability, it can, become a burden to the user. So do you think we need explainability also for low risk situations or contexts?
Yes, I think we need it. I think it's just a good thing to have it because we have to expect that the most of consumers that use these technologies, they are not AI experts. So in the end, nothing can go wrong if we tell them with our products how the internal mechanisms works. Maybe they educate themselves that way. I'm just curious about maybe the kind of explainability that we need that will not be the case-by-case explanations. Like whenever an AI system in a low risk setting does something, we would immediately have to throw an explanation to the user. I think for this low risk setting, it's more a question and answer game. So when people might ask for explanations, but then at least we should be capable of also delivering them then.
I want to jump in. And like, obviously, like my research is in interpretable systems, so clearly I care a lot about them. But I would push back a bit in the sense that I think that, especially in a low risk setting, we have to ask why are people asking for the explanation? Is it because they did not like a behavior of the system? Is it that they want to make sure that in aggregate, like the system is still behaving fairly because, like a conversational agent might be relatively low risk, but you don't want it to be spouting incorrect things, especially to certain in biased ways to populations. And there might be other ways of getting to that ultimate need, because explanation is ultimately, it's a means to some goal. And so I just want to leave that door open, that maybe if there are reporting mechanisms to say, I didn't want this to happen, don't make it happen again. Or there are surveillance mechanisms that make sure that we're keeping track of various behaviors and making sure that those behaviors stay within certain bounds. And then internally, the company might need to do some debugging and explanation of like the developer, mucking with the algorithm. But maybe the user doesn't always need explanation in all of these contexts. And maybe some of these hard statistics are even more concrete.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to add a quick comment here, but it's about, definitely different levels of risk needs different levels of transparency. And as I think both Finale and Philip are saying probably the same thing, is that also how much we want to reveal transparency, or, like let it the user finds it if it needed, like different levels of like, is it a progressive transparency? Is it a push type of transparency? Is it, but one thing also I need to say is that we still don't know what is low risk. Like I work on like a lot of like what I call high stake systems. And I always question myself, okay, you call like many of these public algorithm systems, predictive policing, which is a very controversial and challenging thing that I think even should not exist in the first place, or like family, like child maltreatment systems, like they are higher stakes, yes. But is like a Facebook explanation tool about why you are seeing a post is low risk because, or because, we've seen scientifically that, for example, Facebook or other social media platforms can change an election's results by just their feed. So that goes back to that butterfly effect, like if we don't know how this affects. So I think also that that might be also a reason that we might need transparency in any, like it might differ in terms of how we push the transparency, like again, like what's the modality of transparency. But I think at the same time, we even don't know what is low risk and what is high risk. Like the high risk or higher stakes are like more, that we call them higher stakes, they are more immediate high stakes. But even a conversational AI can be, I can see a kid using Alexa wrong, maybe asking for like wrong websites or wrong information, or like even some things that might like endanger their health. So again, like all of these can be high risk.
I totally agree. And actually, maybe there's also a distinction that maybe I'm trying to make to push. So I agree on the butterfly effect, that part. And I think that's maybe an important distinction, like high risk versus low risk. There's systems that can just go out of hand and they might not seem high risk. But I'm still not entirely sure to what extent transparency would prevent that from happening. Like, I think that sometimes it can, but perhaps like, or kind of more, we shouldn't lose while trying to chase transparency the surveillance of the system is going.
Yeah, I totally agree. Transparency is not auditing or putting, transparency is just one of the mechanisms to make the system accountable, but usually system already might have done what it should not have done.
As soon as it starts to
Transparency.
rails, you need that surveillance mechanism. Someone's watching.
Exactly. You need an auditing party. You need like, exactly. Like, I think that what is important is that, like, you know, as much as I work on transparency, I work on auditing and supervising the systems as well. And I think they come hand in hand. We need both. And other mechanisms. We need policy, regulations. We need a lot of stuff. And I think there was something also in this XAI or whatever we want to call this transparency area, that people sometimes mistake transparency as the only way or as a way to hold the system accountable. I think it's needed, but it's not enough at all. Because as you said, I totally agree. I don't think that transparency is not an unmitigated good, you know, like it's not going to fix the problems. We are either each of these mechanisms, we are not going to be able to fix it. And I know it's disappointing for many probably people here is that, you know, when you start working on transparency, you're like, oh, that's going to solve all the problems. No, that's not a solution fits all. It's just something we need along with many other things we need. And that's also we need to see like our expectations of transparency and how it affects trust or the performance of the system.
Yeah, okay, thank you. There's another question that is also like related to accountability for Philip. What are your thoughts on accountability when it comes to autonomous cars? It's a very general question. Maybe you can, I don't know, you can try to narrow it down somehow and answer it in relation with your own research, maybe?
Yeah, I think this is also where the car example becomes interesting, because here we can then talk about two types of explanation and two types of transparency. The one, what I was talking throughout this discussion is like, what kind of transparency can we provide to a driver to make the system, the corporation working? But the other part of explainability would be when an accident already happened, how can we explain in court, for example, what were the reasons for that accident? And it's also in a way that there is a reason why in Germany we have not seen that many tests of AI-controlled automated driving functions on the road, because there are laws that are stating that whenever something happens in court, the engineers must explain to the very high detailed level why it happened. And they cannot do that with its systems. They can do that mainly with rule-based system like an adaptive cruise control. But whenever there are multiple detection mechanisms involved and so on, it's not completely clear why at a certain moment the car has produced a certain outcome. And when it's not clear that when we would have the exact same situation, that the car will guarantee, then we have a problem. And this is where all the explanations related to accountability come in, so to say. So we might expect that the laws might change a little bit and maybe more relaxed also in Europe in the future. But we need to take the boundary here between what kind of explanations we need later on, where we have maybe months to look at them and evaluate them, or the real-time interaction that happens on a daily basis, so to say.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. And I have the last question that I have is for Finale. What are your thoughts about how to empower the communities? I'm not sure. I think maybe user communities. I don't know what they actually mean with community, which communities. But maybe you can talk a little bit about empowerment of the users if you have.
So I do think that ultimately they're different. It does come down to forms of transparency and mechanisms, like lightweight reporting mechanisms that someone else will help take care of. Because if you are coming from a marginalized group or an affected community, you probably don't have a lot of resources and time and all of these things. So it's really important to make it possible to observe an issue and then have something done about an issue. I think that that part is really also that, there's a second half, right? To see the problem and then address the problem. And in terms of seeing the problem, again, there's transparency about the algorithms that we've been talking a lot about, but also transparency on a higher level about like what was the process, what was the checklist that was followed, and the reporting of all of these sorts of the data that were used, the checks that were performed, all of this sort of thing. So just making that available. Because again, if one marginalized individual or one affected individual doesn't have a chance to check that, hopefully a group of people or an advocacy group or someone, has a mechanism to look through that documentation and help connect the dots when something is not going right. And then you need regulation with enough teeth that say that once an issue has been brought up, it needs to be resolved. And, we need like a fallback mechanism. And this is in some of the checklists that say that, if your updated version of the system starts behaving in a funny way, maybe you have to go back to that, rather simple rule-based system that you were hoping to improve from, because at least it doesn't have this problem, or what is there?
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, I think I'm done with the question of from the users. Maybe I just ask Marisa a question that I have myself, and then I can take your closing remarks, and we are, I think, at the end of this panel discussion. So Marisa, a question that I have, briefly touched this topic of the image of the company, or let's say this decision that users have already made up in their mind when buying the device. So how do you differentiate between actually, because you are working on trust in, I would say, performance, or the interaction of the user with the devices. How the interesting thing for me is that how this issue, this initial trust, is actually addressed. Is it like through marketing or marketing strategies or stuff like that? So is it covered there in your company? Is Marisa here?
Yeah, she's muted herself.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I couldn't find my mouse. Yeah, so I can just briefly mention one study a small study I've done with Philip, where we've looked at whether, when we look at trust in conversational AI, where we wanted to find out whether users even differentiate between trust in the AI as the artifact and trust in the designer or the company behind it. So it was just a small pilot study, but what we found was that actually there was a significant difference, that users trusted the provider, specifically big tech, significantly less than the AI itself. So I think the differentiating the trustees within the trust framework, so to speak, I think this is extremely important, and especially in healthcare, I think because that's extremely complicated there, I think that's extremely relevant. However, for my current studies or research, we have not found anything similar. And also we found no influence on performance, for instance. So that was also quite peculiar. The only thing maybe I do want to, sorry, and I have to get back to your question. What was your question again? Did I lost track? Sorry.
Yeah, my question was if this topic is also being, so it's interesting for me to know, let's say, what part of a company is,
okay.
let's say, responsible for the initial trust, especially.
so in our current study, we found nothing alike. We found also I think we touched and tried to measure all these things. Also privacy had no correlation with anything. So it was really interesting that many of our assumptions did not hold true. It did not show any significant results. But what I find is specifically interesting in our latest study is that trust in the conversational AI was extremely rational. So it was much more rational than we expected it to be, because we related it to the relational models. So how people build relationships with humans. And we were pretty surprised that the affective account of trust, the emotional side of trust, was not really just almost not pronounced. And it was a very rational distinction that is a rational account of trust, despite the fact that it's not correlated to performance. So there must be some other factors that are in play here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. So I think we're now coming to the end of this panel discussion. I would like to take one closing remarks, maybe from all of you. What do you think the takeaway would be from this discussion, or what is it that you want to mention at the end of this panel? Who wants to go first?
I can start.
Oh, you start. Yeah.
It's unfortunate that it already ends, because discussions on trust can never be long enough. So I hope this would go for another 6 hours. So, but as we can see it also in the discussion, and also in many of the studies that I do, I'm always somehow unhappy with the conclusions, because there are none. Because when we do the same studies again, we might see different results. All these things are so highly complex that on one hand, sometimes I'm a bit discouraged, because I feel, can I really contribute something in that area? But at the other hand, I'm encouraged a lot, because I feel, yeah, there are so many cool studies that we can pursue. I think one thing that is really important, and this was also touched briefly within the discussion, is we assume that these systems that we all research, that they all are so different when it comes to trust. And I'm not completely sure if that is kind of justified, because on the surface, of course, these systems are very different. But I'm asking myself, is it really the systems themselves that make the difference? Or is it the different kind of trust relations that happen in these kinds of systems that make the difference? And I think this is something we should look at into the future. What are the trusters? What are the trustees? And what is at stakes?
Yeah, thank you very much. So who wants to go next?
I'll go next. Building off of what you said, I think there's a really important question, abstraction, to use the computer science term, about what is it that's common across these different scenarios. I think that's a really important and big question. And the other last bit that I will leave with is, what is it for? Trust, I also think of trust as a means to something. Like, it's not necessarily a good in itself. And are we getting at the ultimate good that we're trying to get at? And is trust the right mechanism?
Yeah, that's also a very good point.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can just jump in, because I do kind of agree. So I think, as I already said, I think differentiating or looking at the different trust actors on the one hand is extremely relevant. On the other hand, I've also wondered, how is trust in conversational AI different than trust in an automated vehicle? So these are the things I'm like, how should we measure it, and why? What's the outcome out of it? Like, what's the benefit? And then I also think, to be a little bit cynical here, everybody has to defend why he's doing or she's doing research on product X. So it's also something you have to say, there's not enough research in conversational AI specifically, and we want to look at, there's lots in social robotics, but not with Alexa, so we really got to do this. I'm sorry for being very honest here. can say that because I'm from the industry and not an academic. So that is just my opinion. I'm sorry for that. And last but not least, I think my final words are what I find a bit hard is I'm a psychologist by education. So in psychology, we look at really tiny concepts like trust, measure them, and an outcome variable, right? So it's really, really tiny things that we measure and compare, etc. But the moment where we, broaden the context, we look at normative standards, we look at ethics, we look at regulation, we look at policy. So I find it hard to integrate all these things. So on the one hand, we're talking a lot about transparency within, normative context, which is great, but it doesn't really help us to further our psychological research, for instance, because this is because we're looking only in tiny things of it. But so I find these discussions sometimes really hard because either they're too small and then they're too big. So I think sometimes it's really good to really just look at, how does transparency, the perception of transparency influence, blah, blah, blah. And then we could discuss it for 3 hours already. But yeah, so this is just sorry, that went longer than I thought.
Thank you also for the feedback. Yeah, maybe for the next time it will be more.
That was not directed to you, that was in general. That was just,
okay.
Sorry, that was not at all like for.
You don't need to be, yeah, it's actually also helpful to have to see it as a feedback. So I'm not like taking it personally. Matara, do you want to also?
Yeah, I think everyone said already very like insightful like comments, and I just had one more advice for people here. If you want to go later and do work on trust, always consider, I think it's brought up like for what and why, but also that how, because trust, as I said, is a very complex construct, and measuring trust is really hard because sometimes we even don't know what we trust or how we trust, or like and again, like trust is not a single shot thing to measure. It's over time, it's evolutionary, and trust also changes but many other factors like transparency, auditing, bias, like it's a lot of interactions here. So consider those in again, this is like having also, even if you find trust good in a system, you just also still know that it's not enough. And we need many other factors to evaluate together, which is, I mean, it's pretty true for everything. You can't usually measure one system's performance with just one single metric. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So sorry that it took like 5 minutes longer as expected or planned. Yeah, I thank you so much again for your for being here and for the interesting discussion. I hope that you've also enjoyed this discussion, at least